Okay, so welcome to the PMP information session. We are going to be talking about the project management classes that we offer here at LFCC Workforce Solutions. And before I get started, Workforce Solutions, let me just explain a little bit about the types of programming that we offer here. LFCC as a whole serves about 20,000 students. We have, over the past several years, hit about 11,000 just in our own department. We also serve over 1,000 employers in our region each year. So basically, the overall mission of LFCC Workforce Solutions is we prepare students for credentials to careers in our local region. The three types of programs that we tend to offer to our community either start, enhance, or change the students' lives that we touch. We offer initial certifications in programs such as CDL, HVAC, medical assisting, pharmacy tech. We offer, under the enhanced category, we offer ongoing continuing education and licensure for teachers and tradesmen, leaders. For example, PMP kind of falls in the enhanced category. And we also offer IT credentials. And then under the change portion of what we do, we tend to serve the underemployed that are working below their potential and need to skill up. So that's kind of how we serve our region as a whole. So today you're here to learn a little bit more about project management and the classes that we have. We have coming up this fall a project management series. It's a 4-part series that takes you through 4 different classes that teach you the basics of project management, and those start in August. And then we also offer the project management PMP credential program. You can sit for either a PMP or a CAPM after taking the course. It satisfies all the hours that you need for that, and that starts in October. So we're going to get into a lot more detail about those programs once I turn it over to our instructor extraordinaire, Chris Grassmonk, who you see right there in the panel. Chris is going to get into a little bit more about, he's going to talk about his background and introduce himself a little bit more fully, and then get into the details of all these wonderful courses that we're going to bring to you this fall. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
All right, thanks, Becky. Guy or whoever's got control, if you can make me a host, I can share some slides. Probably help rather than just looking at my ugly face and bad background. Or not.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Get it?
There we go, Chris.
All right, thank you. All right, I think that's the right one. Let me know when you can see a big gray screen there. Good. All right. So yeah, as Becky mentioned, I've been the instructor here at LFCC for what, about almost 4 years, I guess. I spent about 25 years in project management, as you can see there. 20 of those years have been in government or DoD experience. I've managed both product development projects as well as software development from commercial, again, as it says there, Department of Defense or federal government. My current client is Federal Emergency Management Office, or FEMA. I've spent about going on 9 years supporting them out here in the local Winchester area, as well as some of the clients downtown in headquarters. I spent about 8 years before joining a small technology company there on the left underneath my face. I'm now with Trillion Technologies as Director of Governance, as well as a delivery executive there. Back to IBM, spent almost 8 years there supporting two major programs. One of those was with FEMA and another was with the Air Force, about $15 million. I managed about between those two projects between 20 to 50 full-time staff members, primarily technical folks, but there were also some business administration folks and requirements analysis analysts as well. While I was at IBM, I started growing my love and interest in teaching and facilitating and coaching. And so while I was with IBM, I spent about 3 years with their consulting academy as a faculty member. I've spent 8 years as the vice chair for the local PMI WDC chapter. We have a local community out here. When it wasn't during COVID, we actually hosted some in-person events about once a quarter or once every other month, gave an opportunity for those like-minded folks to get together, earn continuing education credits, and talk about new methodologies and new ideas in project management. As mentioned, I've been about 4 years with LFCC Workforce Solutions, again, furthering my, we're really marrying my passions between education and project management together, and giving an opportunity to help others get certified, whether it's in the CAPM or the PMP certification. And we'll talk about some of the importance of those two certifications. Just real quick, when I'm not teaching or not doing my day job, I'm the father of 2 boys. One's a senior this year, so we're keeping busy on the whole college application thing. And then I've got a 5th grader, so there's quite a diversity of interests there. Other than that, I'm a project management enthusiast. I like talking about the subject, like talking about the various methodologies. Just because I'm PMP certified, I'm also very familiar with the agile methodologies, as well as scaled agile framework, which is SAFE, one of the new up and coming frameworks surrounding agile that supports both Scrum and Kanban. Other than that, we'll keep moving here. With that, I guess I'll pause real quick. If there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Let's see, I'll move the window over here so I can see if anybody's asking anything, or raise your hand, and then Becky, you can just stop me.
Sounds good, Chris.
Great, thanks. So project management, the reason project managers exist, we're not always the doers, especially when you talk when you have those conversations with some of the technical folks, if you're in the technical field, or folks on the floor who are actually doing a lot of the project work itself. But project managers, that customer focused person, that person who integrates or communicates with the client or the customer to translate those requirements over into your project team. So we're customer focused. We're also oftentimes the coach, or a manager who helps build and develop that team. As well as, we realize that we don't have the capabilities and oftentimes the knowledge. I come from a business background, yet I've spent about 20 years managing technical projects. And of course, it's our responsibility, again, kind of back to that coaching, is to challenge and lead our project teams. And of course, one of my favorite topics is to identify and control the risks. If you're not looking out over the horizon for those icebergs that are going to sink your ship, then your ship is going to sink, which means your project is going to fail. And then of course, ultimately, we're responsible for, as a project team, but as the project manager, you're responsible for delivering that project, making sure that it's delivered. If you look on the left-hand side there, delivered with, of course, quality, and then delivered on time, right? And of course, budget compliance is meaning it's delivered, with that agreed upon or approved budget. And of course, making sure that your customer's happy, right? That haven't delivered too much, but you definitely haven't, you've delivered just the right amount of scope. And so making sure that you deliver the right deliverable at the right cost at the right time to, again, ensure that customer's satisfaction. So it's all about the delivery. If you enjoy making the customer happy, if you have a background or experience in that, then project management is a great field to be in. I'll pause just for a second there, see if there's any questions. And of course, you'll notice The items on the left, you've got quality, timeliness, budget, compliance, as well as customer satisfaction, which kind of attribute to this triangle here, right? And if you've spent any time in project management, you'll be familiar with the triple constraints, or the iron triangle, or the golden triangle. So what that contains is, of course, what a project manager's success is measured against. Again, it's time, right? Or schedule, cost or budget, and then of course scope, which helps drive that customer satisfaction, right? You've agreed upon what you're going to deliver to the customer. And then finally, I like to throw in quality, which ties all three of those sides of the triangle together, right? You want to make sure that it's delivered with just the right amount of quality that you've communicated with and agreed upon with your customer. So that's that's the excitement of making sure that these three sides of the triangle here balance out in the end, right? So if your time ends up stretching out, well, guess what? Your scope's going to stretch out as well. This triangle is going to kind of grow. If your customer suddenly wants to increase the scope, or add new features or functionality to whatever you're delivering, whether it's a hardware delivery, a product delivery, or if it's a software delivery, right? That scope starts to creep out, and so is your cost, and most likely so is your time, right? So oftentimes they say you can only can get 2 out of the 3. Well, a project manager tries to deliver all 3 with balance and through communications and agreement. And so why project management? Why this profession? Well, high performing companies are understanding and have really started to understand, and really coming into its own of its understanding over probably the last 20-25 years. PMI, who supports and facilitates the certification itself, has been around a little over 50 years. I think it's 51 years now. But as organizations have realized what projects are and what project work is, that these high performing companies realize that they need to identify and hire certified project managers. And so that's why the certification has experienced such a growth. I was reading an article a little bit ago, and I think by I want to say 2023, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 2027. I mean, there's over 800,000 project management jobs out there. And so there's only a million of us certified project managers right now. And so, the need is there, the need and the requirement for growth is there. That second bullet there, only 2.5% of companies successfully complete 100% of their projects, right? Again, that's why more of us are needed, these certified or trained project managers. What the certification does for you, and I've met plenty of certified project managers who struggle at delivering or executing project management tasks, and vice versa. I've met plenty of folks who are not certified, who could run circles around the certified project managers. But what the certification does, what the education does for you, is it tells that hiring manager, it tells your leadership, or that leadership, that you understand, that you've been through 35 here at Workforce Solutions. It's 36 hours of training, that you understand, you've been through that rigorous training, and then ultimately that certification of 180 questions and passed. So you understand the language, you understand the terminology, you understand the processes that are associated with it, you understand kind of some of the soft skills that we talk about during the 9-week course. Only 26% of projects succeed, right? That's why there needs to be more training. That's why Becky and I and Guy and the team have developed these additional courses to help slowly build you into that training, into that larger lexicon of knowledge that PMI provides and the project management certification provides. And so, if you do have your certification, it's a great opportunity, in those 4 classes to earn continuing education credits. And I'll talk about those in the upcoming slides that we have here. And of course, communications is key. As you can probably tell by my voice, I spend a lot of times communicating to my clients. So that's, oftentimes we're that one throat to choke, right? So if our client has a question, has a comment, has a complaint, then usually they're looking for the project manager to, to ask those questions or to throttle my neck. So you have to make sure that you are that conduit, you are that go-between person between your project team and that client, to make sure that they're satisfied, right? And then finally, 3/4 of projects fail because senior management doesn't get involved. And so that's why a PM needs to be assigned to a project, right? Senior leadership doesn't have time to spend managing and developing and leading these projects, so they need to identify more project managers. More project managers or folks interested in project management need to step up and take on those roles. It's an exciting profession. No one day is like the other. At any given time, I'm the CEO of my project. Therefore, I get to lead it and do all the fun stuff as a leader. Or I'm also the CFO, right? I'm responsible for the budget, or I'm also responsible for that team, that project team. That I have, to make sure that they're getting all their needs satisfied, that the project is satisfying what they're looking to get out of their career, making sure that they're compensated for the job that they're doing, and making sure that they're happy, making sure that they're being challenged. A long-term project, making sure that they receive the training that they need for not only the job that they're doing currently into my project, but that they have knowledge and training that they can take on to the next project. I'll pause real quick, see if there's any questions. All right. Quiet group today. So jumping in here real quick, as Becky mentioned, the upcoming classes here, and I mentioned that 4 group. Oftentimes it can be the intro class or set of classes and core competencies, or it can also be, an opportunity to gain continuing education credits. So starting the 11th, I think we have the Stakeholder Management course, which is called Identify, Prioritize, and Understand Your Stakeholders for Project Success. So we chose these 4 courses based out of the PMI PMBOK, or the Program Management Body of Knowledge. And so after training or teaching a couple of these PMP prep courses, I discovered that a couple of the topics within that course, students would kind of have these aha moments, or something would resonate, or there was occasionally trouble on gaining or grasping the concept. And so I chose these 4 topics because of that, to kind of further define or further refine these particular knowledge areas. So again, back to the stakeholder management, stakeholders are important, right? Those are the folks that are impacted or have impact to your project. So making sure that they're happy and that they're communicated to is very important. So we, over the course of 2.5, 3 hours, 3.5 hours, we talk about, how to identify those stakeholders, how to prioritize their needs, how to prioritize the communication to them, and making sure that we understand what those are, what those needs are, what their requirements for communication are. So it's a hands-on course, a little more hands-on than the exam prep courses, which is making sure that you understand all the material in that exam prep course. But this is more hands-on. We take on a real life project, real life set of stakeholders that we as a class identify and walk through those various processes. And then we've got the project schedules, which is 6 steps to project scheduling. It is not a Microsoft project course, but it is understanding how to take those baby steps or execute those baby steps through developing a project schedule, which is, again, all important, something that a project manager needs to be concerned about, so that we can deliver on time to our customer. Project management plan, project schedule, and project management plan often get confused in terminology. That's why That's why taking the PMP prep class or one of these classes is important, so that you understand the glossary of terms, that knowledge. So project management plan is just that. How are you going to execute the project? And so you're putting that into your project management plan. How are you going to manage risk? How are you going to identify risk? How are you going to identify your stakeholders? How are you going to manage your stakeholders? How are you going to manage communications? How are you going to manage scope? All that stuff goes into your project management plan. So like those other two courses, we actually get hands-on and go through those sets of processes there. And then finally, we wrap up with risk management. Like I said, it's something I'm passionate about within the project management field. Identifying, analyzing, and mitigating those project pitfalls is important, right? You want to make sure that you can track along as best you can to make sure that you deliver on time, on budget, and within the scope that you've agreed with the customer. And so, identifying those risks early and figuring out how you're going to mitigate those risks is important to project success. And then finally, in the October timeframe, we've got the big daddy here of the PMP exam, PMP CAPM exam prep course, right? And so back in January of this year, the exam changed, the materials changed a little bit. The PMBOK, we've got a new PMBOK coming out this month. The old PMBOK 6th edition is still valid, still useful. In fact, I still have a deep belief in a lot of the material that is within there and a lot of the processes and process groups there. But that course is over 9 weeks. At the end, the expectation is that you will sit for the exam within a given period of time. Oftentimes, I tell a lot of my students, it's not a science; it's more of an art. But as we go through the process, usually I get a pretty good feel of who's ready and when. So by the end of the class, I can typically give you some advice on, where you need to study and how much longer you need to study, and then when you can sit for that exam. And just jumping through some of the details of those classes, I think I covered in just stakeholder management. Some of the expected end results there. You'll be familiar with how to identify your internal and external stakeholders, right? Plan that stakeholder management to make sure that you keep them happy, keep them informed, and keep them engaged. And then make sure that they're supportive of your project and that they're involved. And better yet, that they're involved at the right times and that they're not meddling in, while you're trying to progress along the timeline of your project, that they don't hinder your project. Next up there is the 6 steps to project schedule. We'll figure out how to plan a schedule or project schedule, determine the action steps that need to be accomplished, and then establish the order and the time frame of those action steps or those actions within your project schedule. So it's a little more than just a pretty little Gantt chart. Oftentimes, and if you take that course, you'll hear me give the example. I spent 8 years in IBM, and I think I did a project schedule in MS Project only once. Most of the time we kept our project schedules within Excel. But either way, through this, at the end of this course, you'll understand the steps and the requirements to build a schedule. The project management plan, as I mentioned, is not your project schedule, right? As a project manager, you're responsible for preparing and planning to make sure that your project goes right. So this project management plan is where is kind of your standard operating procedures for your project. Oftentimes, depending on your background, it's what I call the project Bible, right? Anything you need to know or need to find out on how your project is supposed to be running should be found in that project management plan. So we touch on all the subcomponents of that project management plan, which includes the scope, the cost, the schedule, human resources, communications, risk management. Again, all of those have been identified and supported by PMI. And then finally, the risk management, right? You'll learn how to plan, identify, and analyze and ultimately mitigate those risks, right? And if those risks do become a reality, then those things are called issues. And so if it becomes an issue, it's something that you have to deal with, hopefully through the risk management plan that, you have a mitigation strategy or a strategy to deal with that risk when it does become an issue. And so finally, as I mentioned, here's the big course, the long course. It is a long, intensive 9-week course. I typically spend the first night of the class, not intentionally scaring you, but kind of giving the cold hard facts or the reality of what you're in store for. It's, it is an intensive course, but again, the certification is extremely widely accepted and widely sought after out there in the job market. So they've broken down, like I said, in first part of this year is supposed to be about a year ago, but COVID kind of pushed it to the right. They have started testing on these three new areas. Prior to this, it was all about processes and the process groups and the knowledge areas. And now they've kind of broken that out over these three major components, which is people, processes, and then business environment. I've had some folks who have sat for the exam. They think it's a little bit easier than the old test. And it's, it's a lot of the same materials. So a little more of the soft skills. One of the great things I like about the new teaching materials as well as the new exam is it's also focused not only on the traditional methodology, which oftentimes people call waterfall, but also teaches and starts to touch on a little more heavier on the agile methodologies. So you do get both of those good balance of that training during this course. And of course, then, at the end of it during that exam, they test you on it, right? And so the old exam used to be about 200 questions. Now it's about 180 questions. There's 200 questions, I think only 170, 175 were graded. It's the same for this one. They give you 180 questions. They give you 5 or 10 throwaway questions there. You have about, about 4 hours, almost 4 hours to take that exam. There you see 230 minutes to complete the exam. There's a 10-minute break, I think, built into there now. Back in the olden days when I took it, you didn't get that break thrown in there. It was, you had to take your break and take the exam all within 240 minutes. I will pause there if there's any other questions, or if there are any questions, not any other questions. I've been rattling off and rambling there for 30 minutes.
Question.
Yep.
For the PMP certification course, is it required to take the 4 other courses? No. So if I wanted to prepare for the certification, this would be the course that right now we're on the slide. I'll be interested. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Good question.
And while we're just on topic of the 4 other courses that we were talking about, part of the bundle, those 4 courses he talked about, the stakeholder, then project schedules, project management plan, and risk management, those classes are set up to run every 2 weeks. And like you saw on the other slides, they're about, let's see, from 5 to 8, so about 3 hours for each class. You can take those a la carte, or you can take them in a bundle. If you take them in a bundle, it's you do have a bit of a discount if you take the full 4 classes, and the bundle price is $259. And then like Chris was just articulating, the PMP certification class, yes, that is the longer of the courses, and it's mainly to prep you for that exam, and that's $13.99. We do have some locality funding for certain folks that live in certain areas, which I'm sure Guy or Ramona that are on the call can explain that. But other than that, you do have to pay for the courses up front. And if the locality funding, if you're not living in a region in which we have the locality funding, then you can go through Sally Mae and get a loan to take the course.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah,
Uh,
I threw in a question there in the chat just to see if anyone is currently a project manager. I've trained both folks who are currently project managers. I've also trained folks who are interested in becoming project managers, and I've also had opportunities to train folks who just wanted to learn a little bit more or gain a certification that they knew was important. Let's see. Here's the current PMP certifications. Once you start your application, you have about 90 days. You have 90 days to complete it within the course material provided by Workforce Solutions. There is some online material that you have. One of those digital components is a sample application. Oftentimes encourage students to start filling that out as they start the class, and then by the end of the class, hopefully they have it filled out. We can take a look at it, and I can look it over for any pitfalls or any questions that that they may have challenges for when they do go to apply. Once you're approved to sit for the exam, you have 1 year to take the exam. And of course, to apply, you have to have, if you have a bachelor's degree, you need 3 years of project management experience, or about 4,500 hours of leading or directing a project. Or if you don't have a bachelor's degree, then it's 5 years of project management experience, and about 7,500 hours of leading or directing projects. Don't become scared of those numbers. You'd be surprised what they count as projects or what you can count as projects. So again, that's a conversation worth having if you do have any of those concerns. And of course, you need 35 contact hours from a project management course, for which this certification exam course covers that. Of course, the fees to the PMI Center, I think it's about $450 for the test. You can take it up to 3 times in a year if you don't pass the first time. And then I think there may be if you're a PMI member, I think it's a $50 discount.
Sorry, I missed that part. How much was it again for the exam?
It's about $450 if you're not a member of PMI. If you're a member of PMI, which I think the cost to be a member is about $50, then it's I think $400 to sit for the exam.
Okay.
And where do they offer the exam, Chris? I forget. Is it Falls Church or?
I think the closest one is Falls Church, if I recall correctly. Of course, that's changing all the time, especially as when we entered COVID, and now that we've come out of COVID, it's changed. But you know, that's something that I'd be happy to walk through with the students once they're ready. Just switching over here to the CAPM course. If you have a high school diploma, so it's associate's degree or equivalent, it's 1,500 hours of project experience, or 23 contact hours from a project management course. Of course, again, this 36-hour course will more than cover that. Once you have taken project management course, you do not have to take it again. That satisfies if you sit for the CAPM, and then it also satisfies if you choose to sit for the PMP later. You do not have to sit for the CAPM to go on to sit for the PMP. You can jump right to the PMP if you have that level of experience. That's the end of all the fun stuff I had to share off the top of my head, at least as it relates to the course. I do have a couple of slides surrounding PMI and the local chapter, but I'll stop there to see if there's any other specific questions.
As far as project management hours that are put in goes, how do we, I guess, does the application walk you through it? And do you need, I'm guessing you'll need your supervisor's approval on those, correct?
Yes, you'll want to identify somebody who can vouch for those for those hours or for those projects especially. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a supervisor. It just needs to be somebody who can vouch for those hours.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And while you're thinking of other questions, I wanted to introduce our coach, Julia Bridgen, who's on the call. If you're not quite sure if you want to take maybe the basic project management classes or jump right into the PMP certification class, she can be a resource for you to help you with some guiding questions to figure that out, or any other types of questions you may have for the programs that we offer. Please continue to ask your questions either in chat or just go ahead with questions verbally when ready.
Oops, I'm talking on mute. Sorry about that. I'll just move it over here for a second. PMI is, a huge, like I said, been around for about 51 years. It's about 2.9 million. By this time, there's probably over 3 million PMI professionals. Across a varied and actually growing number of certifications that PMI provides. There's over 1 million certified PMPers. There's about 500,000 members of the organization, spread all over the world. I've had an opportunity to actually speak to one of the chapters over in Slovenia, 3 years ago. So it was pretty exciting. And it's always interesting to see who's certified. Because again, you're able to speak that common language. And then this is the local PMI WDC chapter. We've got about over 10,000 members. Since COVID, we've been doing all of our meetings online at the chapter level, which is actually a great benefit, to be quite honest, given that they always have their chapter meetings before COVID down in the McLean Tysons area. So for those of us who work and live out here in Shenandoah Valley, it's difficult to get down to those meetings, but since they've had them online, it's a lot easier. Benefits of this chapter is it's 10,000 members. You get an opportunity to obtain continuing education credits to continue to remain certified. And just they've got a great job board. They've got a book club, and just again a great opportunity to kind of associate with other members. I've mentioned continuing education credits a couple of times and realized, so what? So once you do obtain your PMP certification or your, well, not so much with your CAPM, but your PMP certification or some of the other certifications that PMI has, you have to maintain your education. So you have to gain 60 continuing education credits or PDUs every 3 years. So it's average of about 20 a year. And so that's another reason PMP and PMI is so well respected out there in the industry, is that they know that their certified members are continuing to stay on top of their education, top of the methodologies out there that are effective in running projects. So as I mentioned, let's say you sit and pass, you take the 9-week course, you sit for the exam, you pass the exam, and you say, okay, now what? How do I get my continuing education credits? Well, it's that series of 4 classes is a great opportunity, because those count towards those continuing education units. So it's an opportunity to come back and see my ugly face again and talk about project management and dive a little bit deeper. What else? Other questions? And yes, retail projects do count as projects. I had a stay-at-home mom who homeschooled her kids didn't realize the number of projects that she actually had managed and was valid for her application.
You might have gone over this, but to get started on this application, where do we go, or how do we get access to the application?
So you can get access to the application through pmi.org,
Okay.
right? But of course, if you don't have the project management education yet, then you definitely want to sign up for the course. And that's as salesy as I get, Becky and Guy. Sorry.
Believe it or not, Chris, we're glad you're not salesy.
Thanks.
So to register for the course, I'll go ahead and just put some things in the chat. You can call or you can go online to register. If you do live in one of those localities that Guy Curtis put in the chat, you'll definitely want to call to find out what scholarships are available. Scholarships do run out quick. As you can imagine, when you have students going into courses that are, $13.99, those scholarships run out quick. So you're going to want to call quickly to see if they're available. But other than that, like we said, we do participate with Sally Mae regularly. So if you're interested in reaching out for that, then you can call us and we can help you get started with that as well. I'll put our phone number in the chat, but also you can register online at lfccworkforce.com. So you have both of those options. There's our phone number and lfccworkforce.com. So you can register either of those two ways. Please feel free to ask questions. We're also recording this, so when folks watch it, if we miss something or you need better clarification, the folks that are watching the recording have the benefit of all your questions, so please ask away.
Yeah, it's so it's just kind of give some insight on the classes themselves or the course itself. I like to think I have an interesting teaching style that hopefully keeps most folks awake for the 4 hours a night that you're there. I like to integrate some sarcasm, some real life experiences as well as real time experiences. So the topics that we're covering are, I relate back to either my experiences that I've had or try and relate them to your experiences. So, I'm constantly, similar to this call right now, encouraging the students to speak up and ask the questions. It can be a long 4 hours if I'm sitting up there and just going through the materials and going through the slide deck. It's much more, students get a lot more out of it when they can hear their peers talk about the experiences that they've had. I see a question in the chat. If you happen to miss a class, let me know. Again, it's oftentimes a tight schedule, but I'll work with you separately. Ultimately my goal isn't to push you through the 9 weeks. My goal is to get you PMP certified or CAPM certified. So that's my passion. It's just Workforce Solutions is just a conduit to help you get certified and help me, help more people get certified. Oh, good. Required books and software. So at the start of this class, give me 1 second. I'll go off camera here. There was an opportunity to review some of the materials. Becky and team have found a really great materials provider. I think that's coming in a little blurry, but it's you get both hard copy as well as access online to this material, as well as not slides, flashcards, study material, chapter quizzes, process quizzes. So it's really an all-encompassing 3-4-legged stool. So it's listening to me drone on for 4 hours a night, or 4 hours each night for 9 weeks, as well as, you know, study on your own, as well as the online materials to make sure that you're, you know, ingesting and understanding and learning the materials. And then I do suggest you buy the PMBOK, the program manager's body of knowledge, to help round out that bunch of material. It, you know, it does feel like it can be pricey, but I can tell you right now, difference between a certified project manager versus a non-certified project manager is, when it comes to salary, it's, you know, it's about a 20% difference. So it's the certification is worth it.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth it. But like he said, all the books do come with it, the PMP CAPM certification books. But the PMBOK does not come with it. So along the way, if you're serious about this, like he said, you're gonna probably want to make that purchase. Do you get it when you register, if you would register for the, like if you became a member for PMI, is what I'm trying to say. Does the book come with it, the PMI PMBOK?
You did. That's a great question. Yes, you do get a digital copy of the PMBOK.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
That might be their way of getting
Yeah.
that book. Okay. But the materials are quite extensive. A lot of folks comment on how much they like the materials because there's so much added reinforcement that you can use outside of class. And yes, Beth had mentioned in the chat, yes, we're going to offer them again in the spring, the 4-part series, as well as the full-blown certification course. I don't have the dates out there just yet, but they'll be out there by the end of September. You can check. By the end of September, you'll see the dates on our website.
What else? Let's, I think we tapped out all my questions or slides. Any general questions about project management?
How long is it valid for?
These
Certification?
the certification. So again, you have to maintain, you have to get your 60 continuing education credits every 3 years. And so you know, you're encouraged to do that because you don't want to sit and take the test again. So the CAPM has a duration to it. It's a 5-year certification. But yeah, the 60 continuing education credits sound pretty daunting when you think about it. Or, you know, you're freshly minted, you know, PMPer, and suddenly you're looking out and saying, oh boy, I've got to keep going through this. It's not as hard as it looks. In fact, you know, PMI is fairly generous in some of those continuing education credits, because you can count, you know, some of your work, reading articles or reading books about project management, as towards your continuing education credits. And then they have a triangle of technical, strategic, and leadership to, you know, that they try and guide you towards getting continuing education credits, certain number of continuing education credits in those 3 categories. Again, that's, you know, to encourage the certified members to keep up their education, kind of keep pushing the industry. And again, that you know, the course and the exam itself do touch more and more on the agile methodologies. So we do talk about that quite a bit in the course. And so when you are done with the course, you are able to, you know, identify the right methodology for the projects that you're looking to, you know, take on, or that you end up getting assigned to.
All right, so if we're not hearing any more questions, we may sign out a few minutes early. Guy, do you have anything to add before we sign out, or Julia or Ramona? All right, well, hearing none, I guess we're gonna go ahead and close out. Feel free, let me go ahead and also put my phone number here in the chat. Like I said, I'm Becky McKee, the program manager. If you have further questions for me, program specific, or if you'd like to talk with Julia, she put her information in there from a coaching standpoint. All right, well, thank you guys very much for attending, and we hope to see you in class this fall or spring.
Definitely.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.